The big day is almost here. Election Day is Tuesday.
The 2024 campaign has been dizzying and unprecedented, but you can sort of trace the arc of it with what happened at two arenas in Atlanta.
We're live from Georgia, a key battleground state in the race for the White House. In just moments, the current U.S. president will debate the former U.S. president as their party's presumptive nominees, a first in American history.
In June, former President Donald Trump and President Joe Biden met on a CNN debate stage.
Across the street at McCamish Pavilion, Georgia Tech's basketball arena, throngs of reporters, pundits, and politicians gaggled, filed, and spun.
And I'm going to continue to move until we get the total ban on the total initiative relative to what we're going to do with more Border Patrol and more asylum officers.
President Trump?
I really don't know what he said at the end of that sentence. I don't think he knows what he said either.
Biden's shaky debate turned into a disaster for Democrats. Within weeks, Biden stepped aside and Vice President Kamala Harris stepped in.
Her first major rally as the newly minted presumptive nominee was in Atlanta at the Georgia State University Convocation Center.
So, Georgia, it is so good to be back, and I am very clear. The path to the White House runs right through this state.
Trump rallied at that same arena days later, arriving back in Atlanta to a changed race.
Now that they've swapped out Biden, they took away his presidency.
And this week, Trump returned to Atlanta again, rallying at McCamish Pavilion, steps away from the debate stage that changed the 2024 election. I'm WABE Politics reporter Sam Gringlas.
And I'm WABE Politics reporter Rahul Bali. On today's episode, we'll hear Trump and Harris's closing arguments and a preview of what to expect on election night.
I will hold both parties accountable to you, the voters of Georgia. And I stand ready to defend the results of the election with election officials all across the states. We will do our job.
Also, we'll take a look at competitive state legislative races in Metro Atlanta and how Trump's complicated relationship with Governor Brian Kemp could shape what happens in Georgia.
Well, I want to win. So we're all fighting to make sure we win from the top of the ticket all the way down to the bottom.
Plus, we'll hear from 5 voters who could determine the 2024 election result.
That's all coming up on Plugged In, a WABE Politics podcast.
Support for Political Breakfast comes from Chicory Wealth, offering fee-only financial life planning and socially conscious investing, helping people to not only work toward financial well-being, but to use those resources to improve the wider community, be that social, justice, the environment, education, the arts, or other issues. Chicory Wealth, integrating money and meaning. You can find more information at chicorywealth.com.
You love free, and at Ameris Bank, so do we. That's why we're proud to offer worry-free, hassle-free Ameris Bank free checking. Manage your money your way with convenient access to digital, mobile, and telephone banking, all with no monthly service fee or minimum balance requirements. At Ameris Bank, we're with you. For more information or to open an account, visit our local bankers in person or online at amerisbank.com/free checking. Other fees such as overdraft fees may apply. Ameris Bank, member FDIC, equal housing lender.
We're going to start with the presidential race and the candidates' closing arguments. Vice President Kamala Harris began to roll out hers in a speech on the ellipse in front of the White House, where Trump held a rally on January 6, 2021, before the attack on the U.S. Capitol.
Harris talked about patriots who fought for freedom from a petty tyrant, and at Normandy, Selma, Seneca Falls, and Stonewall, fought to preserve and expand that freedom.
They did not struggle, sacrifice, and lay down their lives only to see us cede our fundamental freedoms. They didn't do that only to see us submit to the will of another petty tyrant. These United States of America, we are not a vessel for the schemes of wannabe dictators. The United States of America is the greatest idea humanity ever devised.
Now, Trump rallied this week on the campus of Georgia Tech and painted a darker picture of the country plagued by crime and illegal immigration.
November 5th will be the most important day in the history of our country, and together we will make America powerful again. We will make America wealthy again. We will make America healthy again. We will make America strong again. We will make America proud again. We will make America safe again. And we will make America great again. God bless you. God bless you. Go out and vote, Georgia. Go out and vote. Thank you. God bless you all. Thank you.
And Rahul, I was at that rally, and it came a day after another rally at Madison Square Garden where some guest speakers delivered at times racist and misogynistic remarks. Trump also responded to Harris and others, deeming Trump a fascist, including his former White House Chief of Staff, John Kelly, who's told journalists that Trump spoke admiringly of Adolf Hitler. And Rahul, it was pretty striking to hear Trump at this rally at Georgia Tech saying this in the closing days of this campaign.
I'm not a Nazi. I'm the opposite of a Nazi. I don't know.
You know, Sam, this final stretch has really kind of been a roller coaster. This week, Georgia has had visits from both vice presidential nominees, Tim Walz and J.D. Vance, as well as former First Lady Michelle Obama, who warned young people against apathy.
Yeah, Obama told a crowd of many first-time voters of color that she empathizes with young people who feel disillusioned or helpless to make change, but she said disengaging isn't the answer.
And what a lot of non-voters don't understand about real power is that our absence doesn't make those in charge hear us any better. Instead, our absence is taken as our consent. They take our indifference as part of their mandate to do whatever they want. That has always been the truth of how this country runs. The process goes on with or without you.
And Sam, coming up, Harris will be campaigning in the Atlanta area on Saturday, and former President Trump will be in central Georgia on Sunday.
Rahul, let's talk a little bit more about the actual voting. You covered a press conference with Georgia's Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger this week. What did you learn?
Between the press conference and then a separate conversation I had with the Secretary himself, there's a lot of ground to cover here. First, in-person early voting ends Friday. There's no early voting locations that will be open on Saturday, Sunday, or Monday. This is the time where that shift happens from a number of early voting locations to a much larger number of polling locations. Second, we heard from the U.S. Postal Service this week that if you have an absentee ballot, that needed to be in the mail by earlier this week. So, now that we've kind of passed that recommended deadline, Gabriel Sterling, who's the Chief Operating Officer for the Secretary of State's office, said this during the Wednesday press conference.
If you haven't gotten your absentee ballot yet, make a plan to go vote in person, either early in your county or on election day. If you have gotten your absentee ballot, us and the United States Postal Service now say, do not put it in the mail. Take it to your local county elections office or the drop box at the early voting location in your county. That way you're protecting your vote. If you have mailed it, sign up for Ballot Scout on your My Voter page at mvp.sos.ga.gov and make sure it's been accepted. If it hasn't been accepted by Thursday night, make a plan to go vote at your local early voting location or go to your regular election day location.
Couple of other things from the press conference. There's been a big focus on shortening lines, and part of that is processing voters faster when they arrive and then using data to work with county election officials to adjust the size or the amount of equipment at polling locations. And Sam, they also kind of know that there could be, and they're likely going to be blasted by the losing side in this election. And specifically, Gabe Sterling talked about the ideas of misinformation and disinformation. Let me give you a quick example. The state of Georgia works on two basic numbers, the total number of registered voters and the total number of active voters. The difference between the two is the number of inactive voters. That's basically the folks who haven't voted in a while, but they've not been removed from the rolls. So the voter registration deadline was October the 7th. So whatever the number of active voters were then, Sam, that number has still been going up. Why? Well, there were some applications that were processed after the deadline. And of course, if an inactive voter votes, then they get added to the active voter line. But of course, you've had people, putting out conspiracy theories of why is that number going up? And it led to this comment from Sterling.
People are making a choice not to believe those of us who are in the government offices, and I get it sometimes. You should be skeptical. You can ask questions, and those can be legitimate. But some of these things are so cuckoo-ca-choo crazy town that it's ridiculous to even try to respond to sometimes.
Sam, what you just heard there may be a little bit of a preview of what we may hear after the election if we end up in a situation where we're having daily press conferences after the election because it's so close.
So, Rahul, you also got a chance to talk more with Raffensperger. What did you learn?
If y'all can come this way, please.
That's right, Sam. Right after the press conference, me and a small group of reporters moved from where the press conference was held at the state capitol into the secretary's office. As you may have heard, millions of Georgians have been voting in person during the early voting period that started on October 15th. As we tape this podcast, more than 3.5 million, about half of Georgia's 7.2 million active voters have already cast a ballot, and we still have all of Friday in-person early voting to go. And, of course, we have all the absentee ballots that have until Tuesday to come. The secretary explains that all of this means that a big portion of Georgia's election results will come in earlier on election night.
All the early voting, which is 65%, we believe, of the total votes cast, will be reported no later than 8 p.m. The 5% of absentee, reported by 8 p.m. So now you're going to have 70% of all the votes cast for this election reported by 8 p.m. And then we're going to have continued uploads and upfeeds of everything that happened on election day. And so many of the smaller counties, I think they'll be done, early, probably, 10 to 11, probably 10 to 10:30, something like that. Larger counties, but by the end of the night, we should have, the complete, tabulation and report of every vote that was cast on election day.
Okay, so how's that possible?
So, Sam, the law allows absentee ballots to be counted starting election day morning. Add to that all the in-person early voting that's already been done on Georgia's voting machines. The secretary says election officials could effectively press a button at 7:01 p.m. and get a large percentage of votes already tallied. And really, at that point, election officials are just working on election day votes and absentee ballots that arrived on election day. Also, one other thing to mention, there are military and overseas ballots that have until next Friday to arrive to be processed and to be counted. At last check, there are 14,000 of those outstanding. So, Sam, will we be able to call Georgia on election night? Maybe. What it's really going to depend on is the margin. But by 8 p.m. on election night, we're going to know how a majority of the state voted. And that brings me all the way back to this idea of misinformation and disinformation. The secretary believes that this is going to help with that issue because there's going to be more information and more data earlier in the night.
All right, let's take a break here. This is Plugged In, a WABE Politics Podcast.
Support for Political Breakfast comes from Chicory Wealth, offering fee-only financial life planning and socially conscious investing, helping people to not only work toward financial well-being, but to use those resources to improve the wider community, be that social, justice, the environment, education, the arts, or other issues. Chicory Wealth, integrating money and meaning. You can find more information at chicorywealth.com.
You love free, and at Ameris Bank, so do we. That's why we're proud to offer worry-free, hassle-free Ameris Bank free checking. Manage your money your way with convenient access to digital, mobile, and telephone banking, all with no monthly service fee or minimum balance requirements. At Ameris Bank, we're with you. For more information or to open an account, visit our local bankers in person or online at amerisbank.com/free checking. Other fees such as overdraft fees may apply. Ameris Bank, member FDIC, equal housing lender.
Welcome back to Plugged In, a WABE Politics podcast.
So we've talked about the presidential race and ballot measures on this podcast. Today, we're going to talk about some state legislative races. There are just a few competitive ones, but they are important. Rahul, where are they?
So, Sam, most of these are in the northern suburbs of Atlanta. And if you've been listening to this show for any amount of time, you know that we have profiled voters from these areas. These are folks that were key to President Joe Biden's victory over former President Donald Trump in 2020 in Georgia. They were also key to both Republican Governor Brian Kemp and Democratic U.S. Senator Raphael Warnock, both winning in Georgia in 2022. So let's look at 5 of these races, and let's start with some of the Republican incumbents. State Representative Deb Silcox, her new district is in the Buckhead, Sandy Springs, Roswell area. That's in Fulton County. Her opponent is Susie Greenberg. State Representative Matt Reeves, also a Republican. His district is in Gwinnett County in that Duluth-Suwanee area. His Democratic challenger is Michelle Kang. State Representative Scott Hilton. His district is northern Fulton, western Gwinnett. That's kind of the Petrie Corners area. And his Democratic opponent is Laura Mavartian. I do want to mention a couple of the Democratic incumbents that are also involved in some of these tight races. State Representative Jasmine Clark. She represents central Gwinnett County, including parts of Lilburn. Her Republican opponent is Elvia Davila. And also wanted to mention State Representative Farouk Mughal. He's a Democrat who represents northern Gwinnett County. His opponent is Republican Sandy Donatucci.
And Rahul, why should we care so much about the outcomes of these races? Is control of the state house on the line? And also, why are there so few competitive races?
So, Sam, let me answer those questions in reverse. Why are there so few competitive races? Gerrymandering. The lines were drawn by the Republican-led Georgia legislature when the federal courts ordered another round of redistricting in 2023. This is the first election cycle with those new maps. So out of 236 House and Senate seats, we're really watching less than a dozen races. But of course, there's always the possibility of surprises. We had some in the primaries, so that's something we're going to be watching for. As for the balance of power, the state Senate is not in question, and the House is really not in question, but there are certain realities that come into play when it comes to having a Republican majority versus what I call a working Republican majority. Look, Georgia legislative Republicans do have a handful of members who vote no on a lot of things because of their beliefs on the role of government or spending. There's also the reality that the legislature is filled with part-time lawmakers. Now, look, some are retired, but there's some that still work. I remember a former Republican state lawmaker who was a Delta pilot, Sam. He would miss days because, well, he was flying somewhere. So sometimes just having enough Republican House members to pass something on a party line vote could be an issue because of that or even just illness. And then why does this matter? Look, we've talked about this, Sam. The vast majority of votes in the Georgia legislature are either party line or unanimous. There are a few issues where it's really close. The two best examples, abortion. Georgia's current 6-week ban passed with one more vote than it was needed to pass. And then the other example is gambling. The right coalition is going to be needed to pass anything on gambling, especially a constitutional amendment, which needs a 2/3 majority in both chambers.
What are some of the big picture dynamics you're watching for in these races?
So, Sam, the number one thing that I'm going to be watching for is the polling gap that Republican candidates tell me they have in their races with former President Donald Trump. I've had 3 candidates, including 2 from those northern suburbs, tell me that they are running ahead of the former president. One of them is Republican State Representative Matt Reeves, who, as we mentioned, is running in a Gwinnett County House seat.
Substantially ahead. Well, I've run before, and I've always run better than other Republicans higher than me on the ticket. And I think that's a function of living in Gwinnett County for 21 years, having relationships, and also the things that I've focused on.
And you know, Sam, Reeves mentioned those Kemp-Warnock voters that you have been following. Now, a few minutes after I did that interview with Representative Reeves under the state capitol rotunda, I also caught up with Republican House Speaker John Burns and asked him his thoughts on the same thing.
What we're doing, Rahul, is we're supporting Republicans from the top of the ticket to the bottom of the ticket. And we all have our strengths and we all have our weaknesses. And that's just a part of being a candidate. But we feel like we have a strong team overall when you look at it. And I believe our team will be successful and we'll elect Republicans from the state, from the top to the bottom in this election.
So, Sam, earlier this week, I was on a call with the Democratic Legislative Campaign Committee, which focuses on state legislative races. As I pointed out earlier, their staffers also noted the gerrymandered nature of the state legislative seats, but also noted the progress Democrats have made over the past 4 election cycles since 2014, when Democrats were at a low of 59 state house seats out of 180 in the chamber. They've gone up 20 seats, and they believe there are opportunities to flip a few more of those seats, including the ones that we mentioned a little earlier. In the past 3 cycles, the gains by Democrats have been in the single digits. Now, Governor Brian Kemp has been focusing the efforts of his state Political Action Committee on competitive legislative races. And Sam, I know you've been looking at Kemp's role in this election and how his relationship with Trump could affect the presidential result.
You know, former President Donald Trump campaigned in Georgia on Monday, but missing from the stage was Georgia's popular Republican governor, Brian Kemp. And Rahul, the former president's relationship with Governor Kemp is, of course, complicated, and that could matter to some voters in this state, which Trump narrowly lost 4 years ago.
Yeah, let's talk about the ups and downs of the relationship just this year. And I'm thinking back to Trump's rally in August that I covered when he had harsh words for Georgia's governor.
He's a disloyal guy, and he's a very average governor. Little Brian Kemp. Bad guy.
Yeah, Rahul, as you know, the two fell out after 2020 when Kemp rebuffed Trump's efforts to overturn Georgia's election result. Kemp went on to a decisive re-election victory in 2022 despite opposition from Trump. So when Trump continued to slam one of the most popular politicians in a crucial swing state, many Republicans, like strategist Brian Robinson, scratched their heads.
For Trump, Georgia is a must-win, and he learned a lesson pretty quick in August that going after Brian Kemp was a really bad strategic move.
Though Kemp told reporters he cast a blank ballot in the GOP primary this year, he did say he would support the Republican nominee no matter what. And in a September Fox interview, he made clear he was behind Trump. And that is what opened the door for Trump and Kemp to patch things up.
That's right, Sam. I was there when Trump and Kemp surveyed Hurricane Helene damage in the Augusta area, and we all saw them shake hands.
Well, Brian, thank you very much. Your governor's doing a fantastic job, I will tell you that.
But since then, Kemp has not attended any Trump rallies. Sam, how much is Kemp actively helping Trump in Georgia?
Well, in the final weeks, Kemp has hosted his own Get Out the Vote events. I went to a breakfast for an incumbent lawmaker in a toss-up district, Deb Silcox, at a genteel country club in Atlanta. Kemp barely nodded at the presidential race, beyond a dig at Democrat celebrity surrogates, and he didn't reference Trump at all in his remarks. Instead, he framed his pitch around Republicans' record running state government, like cutting taxes. Pressed by reporters, though, afterward, Kemp affirmed he is still pulling for Trump despite their history.
You know, this is not about me, and it's not about him. It's about the people of this country and what they want. Do they really think they're better off right now than they were 4 years ago?
And Sam, Kemp has built his own sophisticated political operation, now seen as really far superior to the Georgia GOP's, right?
Yeah, Kemp's political action committees are spending roughly $3 million on door knocking, phone banking, and mail. The efforts are focused on those competitive state legislative districts you were talking about, Rahul, and also on opposing Vice President Kamala Harris. What they are not doing is specifically boosting Trump by name. Strategist Brian Robinson told me that Kemp and Trump need each other. The relationship is basically symbiotic. Trump could be helpful or hurtful, especially if Kemp pursues another elected office. And for Trump, Robinson says Kemp may help give uneasy independents and Republicans, especially in the suburbs, permission to vote for the former president.
I don't want to oversell it. It is important, and it's important marginally. But we have an election that will be determined on the margins.
So, Sam, that brings us to the question, did you meet any voters like that?
I did. At that Kemp breakfast, I met Tracy D'Arcy. She was wearing a floral dress, and she's one of the voters who is not enthusiastic about Trump or Harris.
I would love if we had different nominees for both parties, honestly. Nikki Haley would have been amazing.
She says she tends to trust her governor's judgment.
I think he's a very leveled person. I think he is reasonable. It definitely weighs in on sort of which way I might decide to vote.
So D'Arcy has a choice to make in a key state decided in 2020 by less than 12,000 votes.
So let's take one more break. This is Plugged In, a WABE Politics podcast.
Support for WABE comes from Virtual Imaging. Don't wait until you have symptoms of cardiovascular disease, cancer, brain tumors, dementia, or an aneurysm. Virtual Imaging offers annual low-dose CT full-body scanning memberships. Take control of your health. VirtualImagingATL.com. Support for WABE comes from BMW Cars. Introducing EV-Hybrid.com. If you're considering purchasing an electric vehicle or plug-in hybrid, visit EV-Hybrid.com, where you'll learn about the new government credit of 30% of the auto selling price. This program has limitations. Learn more about the program and purchase and installation of EV charging stations for home and business, including the new Tesla Universal Wall Mount Power Sharing at EV-Hybrid.com. Electric transportation and clean energy are possible.
Welcome back to Plugged In, a WABE Politics podcast. As this election comes to an end, we're going to look at 5 groups of voters to watch, and that could play an outsized role in determining what happens with Georgia's election results.
Right, and I first want to offer a couple caveats here. One, Georgia's margins have been so tight in recent elections, so really any small shifts in any demographic of voter could affect the election result. 2, no group is a monolith. There is political diversity within races, classes, and geographies, and these groups may not all break decisively the same way. But after talking to dozens and dozens of voters over the course of this campaign, we're going to talk about some archetypes that will be key to watch.
Okay, so with all of that being said, let's dive in. Sam, what's the first group we're going to look at?
All right, let's stay in the suburbs for a minute and talk about suburban women. Like you said, these are places that have been rapidly changing. They've been growing and also becoming more diverse, but they've also been changing politically in the Trump era, especially in formerly solid Republican territory in North Metro Atlanta. I've returned several times since 2022 to Alpharetta's Town Green, which is decorated right now with spooky scarecrows for Halloween. And I met a group of women, including Emily Lillystone and Shauna Geltz. Both identify as independents. Both voted for Biden in 2020. Both were not thrilled about their choices for president in 2024 and are going different directions from each other. Lillystone is voting for Harris, Geltz for Trump, even though she thinks he is, quote, morally awful.
I don't think as a woman I want the government involved in what I'm deciding to do with my body, and nor do I want that for my daughters.
I completely agree with everything Emily said. However, I feel like my safety walking down the street to get a soda is more important than whether or not my daughter can have an abortion.
Okay, Sam, so who's the next group we're going to look at?
Another group I'm watching, Rahul, are young voters, especially first-time voters. According to Circle at Tufts University, Georgia is one of the youngest states in the U.S. Voters 18 to 29 account for roughly 21% of registered voters in Georgia. But Circle says Georgia has 8% fewer 18 to 29 voters registered now than in 2020. Issues I hear a lot about from young people include student loan relief and housing affordability, as well as reproductive rights, which is something Sydney Craddock, a first-year biology major at Spelman, is thinking about most.
Well, this is crazy because this is going to be my first time voting, and this is probably one of the biggest elections that we had so far. As an African-American woman, to have someone like that in a position of power, like as president, that's just crazy to me.
Now, Rahul, like other age groups, there's a big gender gap among young voters. According to the Harvard Youth Poll survey, young women favor Harris over Trump nationally by 30 points compared to 10 points for men. The Trump campaign sees an opening with young men like Jackson Anderson, a first-time voter who's in trade school for construction management. I met him in line at a recent Trump rally.
I know he's a fighter. I mean, as we saw, July 13th, he got shot and he raised his fist in the air and said, fight, fight, fight. I know he cares about this country and he doesn't give up.
So I think it's really interesting to see how gender is shaping the race for voters getting involved in the political process for the very first time.
Okay, Sam, we've heard stories about polls suggesting support for Harris had softened among black men, though we should note they still overwhelmingly tend to support Democrats and Harris compared to other demographics. I'm wondering what you've heard from black men.
So first of all, black voters account for 30% of Georgia's electorate. Black women are seen as the most reliable Democratic voting powerhouse, with black men not far behind, but there have been signs of some shifts potentially. Recently, I went to Cascade Skating Rink in Atlanta where Usher was doing a Get Out the Vote event, and I met Cascade regular Eric Alston, who's 61, and told me he wishes he had more choices for president. He thinks, like most people, neither candidate is all good or all bad, and he had been considering voting for either of them. One thing he cares a lot about is protecting Social Security as he gets closer to retirement age.
So for our older members of the country that served in the military, worked jobs, kept communities going, raised families, now they're reaching a point where they're not going to receive the help that they paid into a system to receive.
And even though he's not thrilled with either candidate, he told me he would never consider skipping his vote.
Oh, I'm definitely not going to stay at home. No vote is unfathomable from where I come from. I'm born in 1962. I was born without all my rights. There's no way I would abdicate exercising such an important responsibility as a citizen.
And Rahul, even though Alston did have some openness to Trump at some point, he told me in the end he can't get over how the former president conducted himself in office.
And Sam, you know, there's been a lot of conversation on the campaign trail about this issue. And I want to throw in two things. First of all, the strong pushback from Democrats about this idea. And the perfect example of that is U.S. Senator Raphael Warnock, who was very dismissive of the idea of these large percentage of black men backing the former president. You know, some of that discussion may simply be that these are voters who are not switching from the Democratic Party over to the Republican Party, but that these are voters who otherwise wouldn't have voted but have been brought into the fold, at least for this election cycle, to vote for the former president.
And Rahul, there's a rule of thumb that I've been thinking about from UGA professor Charlie Bullock that for Democrats to win Georgia, black voters have to make up 30% of the electorate and Democrats have to get 30% of the white vote. But I recently talked to Professor Andra Gillespie at Emory, who said maybe that can be updated very slightly. Democrats may not need to quite hit that 30% with black voters because of the growing numbers of AAPI and Latino voters.
So, Sam, let's talk about those two groups then.
I first met Judy Zhu and Wei Kang Ding at a state legislative debate in 2022. The midterms were going to be their first time voting as new citizens, and they were among the voters considering splitting their tickets between Brian Kemp and Raphael Warnock. This year, they were taking their votes just as seriously when I caught up with them on the phone. It's their first presidential election they'll be voting in, and they've been watching the debates and reading the candidate and party platforms, really trying to take their vote very seriously. Their daughter is 18 and is also voting in her first presidential race.
It is a very important milestone for us. It is, one of the most important things that motivated us to become citizens. So we decided long ago we're going to vote.
Zhu told me she really struggled with her choice this year. Among their friend group, there's a huge spectrum of opinions. Healthcare, the economy, and democracy are the most important issues to her.
I have definitely changed my mind a couple times before I finally decided who to vote.
Now, I promise not to reveal where the couple landed, but husband and wife went in different directions. According to Asian Americans Advancing Justice Atlanta, Georgia's AAPI population grew by 48% over just 10 years between 2012 and 2022. The largest groups are Indian American, Chinese American, and Korean American. Now, turnout rates have been historically lower than white and black voters in Georgia, but that is changing. The turnout increased by 7% between 2018 and 2022. Now, let me introduce you to some more voters who kind of represent some of this diversity. Ta Vinh came to the U.S. as a refugee from Cambodia in 1980, and I met him at the Peachy Corners Cafe, which offers Vietnamese coffee and bubble tea.
Like, I want to vote Republican, but there's so many things that stop me from voting Republican that I don't.
Now, similar to AAPI voters, Georgia's Latino-eligible voter population quadrupled since 2000, according to the Latino Data Hub at UCLA. They now account for 6% of eligible voters, but registration still lags behind that population growth. And while both Latino and AAPI voters skew heavily Democratic, there is partisan diversity. These are groups Republicans think they can make up ground with. Daniela Usurin immigrated from Uruguay 54 years ago, and I met her at a Trump rally.
Prices of food and gas, they're just getting way too high. I'm retired. I'm glad that I have a pension in addition to the Social Security. Otherwise, I couldn't make it.
And Sam, on this podcast, we took a deeper look at the Indian American community within the Asian American community. And really the most important point you made there was the years that I've watched, the Asian American and Indian American communities, lag behind in terms of voter turnout. And those numbers have really changed here in the past couple election cycles. Let's talk about the final group that you're going to look at, another group that I know really well being from Augusta, Georgia, and that's voters from outside the metro Atlanta area.
Right, Rahul. Of course, there's a whole world outside Metro Atlanta, and while Harris and lately Trump have focused their rallies here in the Metro, which is home to a lot of those swing voters in the suburbs and also the Democratic engine, Democrats think they can lose by less in rural counties and smaller metros. And one way they're doing this is by engaging rural black voters who maybe haven't gotten much attention from campaigns in the past. This is something we saw Warnock and Stacey Abrams do in their recent campaigns. Now, for Republicans, their wins are really powered by their base voters in rural places, and they need to juice turnout there, including by going after low propensity voters who might not regularly go to the polls but might be inclined to turn out for Trump.
And Sam, we're not talking about Democrats winning most of these places. We're just talking about Democrats narrowing the margins in a place like Columbia County outside of Augusta. That's actually where I grew up. That's where my mom still lives.
Yeah, so Columbia County, Trump won in 2016 and 2020, but in 2020, it was by a smaller margin. I met Jennifer Michael at a Nikki Haley rally outside Augusta back in February. She lives in Columbia County, and when I caught up with her on the phone this week, she told me that after Nikki Haley dropped out,
there's been so much turmoil, and I was just, honestly, I had an overarching feeling of dread. There's no other way to say it. I mean, I would switch one day from, well, I'm just not going to vote, to I'm going to figure out who I can vote for that's not them, that will still make my vote count. It just wasn't pretty.
Michael describes herself as an independent, socially more liberal, and fiscally more conservative. She says abortion and protecting Social Security and Medicare are important to her as she nears retirement age. She told me she's had a really hard time making up her mind.
And I still don't know, Sam. It will not be Trump. I can be 1,000% sure it will not be him. Another Trump presidency scares the bejesus out of me.
Where voters like Michael and the others we've heard from today land will be critical in deciding the election result in Georgia and possibly who occupies the White House.
Sam, that does it for this edition of Plugged In, a WABE Politics podcast. The next time we do this show, it's going to be after Election Day.
Will we have a result, though? Unclear. Our producer is Brendan Rivers. Our managing editor is Alex Helmick.
You can get more politics at wabe.org/election2024 and tune in to our live election night coverage streaming and at 90.1.
Talk to you on the other side of Election Day.
No matter what happens in Washington, the NPR Politics Podcast is here for you. For the latest news, insights, and analysis from the election and beyond, listen to the NPR Politics Podcast.
We are in the final stretch of this historic election season. Former President Trump and Vice President Harris are making their last big push before it all comes to a head on November 5th. I'm Scott Detrow. Join us for live special coverage of Election Night 2024 from NPR News. We will bring you the latest as the polls close and the vote totals roll in, with the context and analysis you need to stay informed.
Listen to our Election Night specials starting Tuesday night at 7 on WABE 90.1.